The sun was just beginning to spill golden light across the manicured lawns of Silverwood Estates, casting long shadows across the quiet street. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Pristine houses, freshly trimmed hedges, and neighbors who waved politely, their smiles as polished as the stainless steel mailbox numbers. But behind the clean facades, a different story simmered. I parked my black Tesla in the driveway, its sleek body reflecting the morning light. To the casual observer, I was just another resident enjoying the perks of a well-maintained neighborhood. But that day, my world was about to tilt on its axis. I had spent months designing and installing a state-of-the-art solar panel system on my roof, a project I was proud of. Not only did it save energy, but it also embodied years of research, something I never imagined would become the catalyst for conflict. Then the letter arrived. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Violation. Unauthorized solar installation. It read. The HOA demanded $11,700 in fines, effective immediately. My hands shook as I held the envelope. I knew I hadn't broken any laws. My system was fully certified, installed by licensed professionals, and frankly, I had invented key components myself. I had a choice. Ignore it and hope it went away, or confront the relentless bureaucracy head-on. That morning, I decided on confrontation. I pulled on my leather jacket, grabbed my laptop, and stepped into the crisp air. The neighborhood seemed even quieter than usual, almost holding its breath, as if it knew something was about to change. Across the street, Mrs. Whitman waved at me, her smile polite but strained. She had been one of the first to complain about the solar panels. Her husband, an HOA board member, gave me a curt nod. It wasn't friendly, it was tactical. I realized then that this wasn't just about panels. It was about power, control, reputation. Inside my house, I opened my laptop and reviewed the HOA bylaws once again. Every clause, every regulation I had read a dozen times before now seemed weaponized against me. The irony hit me hard. I had spent years developing innovations in energy technology, patenting my work, and yet here I was being penalized by a community that didn't even understand it. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. As I stepped out to inspect the panels, I noticed a shadow near the driveway, a neighbor leaning casually, pretending to water their plants. I caught their gaze. They looked away too quickly. Subtle, silent surveillance. It was the kind of tension you can feel in your bones, but can't point to. This was not a simple fine. It was an initiation into the unspoken rules of Silverwood Estates, and I was about to learn them the hard way. The days after the fine were tense. Every morning, I would check the mailbox, half expecting another letter filled with threats or technical jargon designed to confuse and intimidate me. At first, the notices were small, almost petty. Trim your hedges to comply with Section 4.2b. One read, accompanied by a photo showing a branch that was barely over the line. Another demanded that I repaint a section of my fence. The color, according to the HOA, did not match community standards. I couldn't help but notice how methodical they were. Every note, every inspection seemed designed not just to enforce rules, but to erode confidence, to remind me who was supposedly in charge. Neighbors who had once waved cheerfully now avoided eye contact. Occasionally, a board member would appear at random, ostensibly inspecting the neighborhood. But really, it felt like surveillance. Every look, every casual comment, carried an unspoken weight. One evening, as I was reviewing the solar panel system, a letter slipped under my door. The envelope was thick, official-looking. Inside was a demand for an additional $5,000, this time for noncompliance with visual aesthetic standards. They claimed the panels reflected too much sunlight. I laughed bitterly. The reflection was minimal, and yet here they were, inventing rules to justify another fine. I knew I had options. I could hire a lawyer, file a complaint, or even escalate publicly. But I hesitated. HOA conflicts were notoriously tricky. A battle often meant months, sometimes years, of stress, paperwork, and social tension. And the last thing I wanted was to become the problem resident everyone whispered about. Yet, as I sat there, staring at my rooftop, I realized something important. I wasn't going to back down. These panels were my work, my invention, a symbol of years of research. And worse, I knew something that nobody else did. I owned the patent. If this escalated, the power dynamic could flip entirely, but only if I played it carefully. Then came the subtle harassment. Sprinklers were mysteriously redirected to spray onto my driveway. Sidewalk cracks appeared overnight. The HOA insisted it was safety compliance, but conveniently ignored every other street. Anonymous notes appeared on my car, friendly at first. "Hope you have a nice day." But the tone quickly soured over weeks into veiled threats. Compliance is easier than conflict. Every act, no matter how small, added pressure. It was psychological warfare under the guise of neighborhood maintenance. One morning, as I stood outside adjusting a sensor on the solar panel, I noticed Mr. Whitman from across the street, watching me with binoculars. I waved, forcing a polite smile, but inside, a storm of anger and disbelief churned. This wasn't a community. This was a chessboard, and I was suddenly in play. That night, I documented everything: photos, letters, even time-stamped videos of suspicious activity. If this escalated further, I needed evidence. Every subtle move, every rule they twisted against me, was now being recorded. I realized that this wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about control, pride, and territory. By the end of the week, the tension was unbearable. I felt watched, judged, and manipulated. But there was a spark forming, a determination I couldn't suppress. I wasn't just going to comply or pay. I was going to uncover every tactic, anticipate every move, and if necessary, use their own rules and my patent to turn the tables. The real battle had begun. The following week, the harassment intensified. Notices arrived faster, fines multiplied, and inspections became daily occurrences. Every knock at the door felt like a judgment. Every casual glance from a neighbor carried suspicion. Then came the letter that changed everything. An official notice stating that the HOA intended to remove my solar panels entirely, citing violation of architectural guidelines and potential hazard to community aesthetics. They gave a 10-day deadline. I stared at the paper, disbelief mixing with fury. My work, my property, my patent, threatened over something so petty. I decided it was time to respond, but cautiously. I began by reviewing the HOA bylaws, section by section. That's when I discovered loopholes. Rules they had twisted to harass me didn't actually apply to the technology or structure I had installed. I smiled grimly. This was the leverage I needed. Next, I consulted my patent documents. The solar panels weren't just functional, they were legally protected. The HOA had no right to interfere with a patented system. My blood boiled as I realized they had been trying to bully me without knowing the stakes. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a formal letter, polite, precise, and unassailable. I cited specific sections of HOA bylaws, attached the patent documentation, and stated clearly that any removal attempt would constitute property interference and patent infringement. I also warned them that legal action would be swift and inevitable if they continued. A week passed. No response. Then an inspection. Mr. Whitman and 2 other board members appeared, clipboard in hand, wearing thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I greeted them calmly, though every nerve in my body was alert. They walked around, pretending to assess, taking notes that seemed increasingly irrelevant. Finally, Mr. Whitman spoke. "We just want to make sure your installation isn't causing any issues." His tone was smooth, practiced, but I knew the threat underneath. I nodded politely. "Of course. And I trust your review is thorough and compliant with the bylaws, correct?" I held up my own copy of the regulations. He hesitated. "Yes, well, we'll be in touch." They left, but the tension remained thick in the air. I knew they were frustrated. They had underestimated me. They didn't realize that for every petty fine or threat, I had counter-evidence, legal protection, and a strategy forming. That night, I documented the inspection, uploaded the footage, and sent a digital copy of my letter to a lawyer friend. The knowledge that I was legally shielded gave me a quiet confidence. But the HOA wasn't done. The following morning, my mailbox contained a new notice, this one more aggressive, implying potential daily fines of $1,000 if compliance wasn't immediate. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pressure like a physical weight. Then came an idea. Why just defend when I could flip the narrative entirely? If they wanted a war, they would get one, but on my terms. I began planning, document everything, anticipate their next move, and prepare for a public reveal if necessary. The stakes had changed. What started as a simple dispute over panels had become a battle of strategy, patience, and intellect. Every tiny act of harassment, every manipulated rule, was now fuel for the confrontation I was preparing. And deep down, I knew the most satisfying part wasn't just winning. It was exposing the absurdity of their control, proving that power alone couldn't intimidate someone armed with knowledge, evidence, and the law on their side. The first major confrontation had passed, but the war was only beginning. I realized waiting quietly would only embolden them. They thrived on fear and hesitation. It was time to act. I decided to strike with precision, using documentation, legal leverage, and public accountability as my weapons. First, I cataloged every notice, every fine, every interaction with the HOA. Photographs of my panels, videos of the property, timestamps, and detailed notes became a meticulous timeline of harassment. Every board member's attempt to intimidate was now evidence against them. Next, I reached out to a local journalist, known for covering community disputes. I didn't want sensationalism, I wanted clarity. I shared the timeline, legal documents, and my patent certification. This isn't just about solar panels, I explained. This is about the abuse of power under the guise of community governance. Within a week, whispers of the story started circulating. HOA members grew visibly nervous. Their confident front began to crack as I started receiving calls, each more hesitant than the last. Then, I sent a formal notice to the HOA, clearly outlining their legal violations if they continued to threaten removal or impose unlawful fines. I made it public to the community, highlighting the specific rules they were bending and the consequences of ignoring legal protections. The effect was immediate. Residents began asking questions. Neighbors started attending board meetings, and murmurs of discontent spread throughout the community. The power balance had shifted. One morning, Mr. Whitman arrived at my door, unusually tense. "We want to discuss this privately," he stammered. I invited him in, keeping my tone neutral, but my mind alert. Inside, he attempted his usual charm, suggesting compromises and mutual understanding. But I remained firm, calmly citing every point in my timeline, every legal statute, and every patent protection. His face betrayed the realization. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was accountability. The negotiation didn't last long. I wasn't here to compromise on my rights. By the end, he left with a promise, vague, forced, and trembling with unease. I stepped outside, sunlight reflecting off my untouched solar panels, feeling a quiet surge of triumph. For the first time, it felt like the HOA recognized the limits of their authority. But the real win wasn't just the panels. It was proof, meticulous preparation, calm resolve, and strategic action could dismantle a structure built on intimidation. They thought they could bully, but they hadn't counted on the strength of evidence, law, and persistence combined. The battle lines were clear now. The HOA could attempt petty fines, veiled threats, or passive-aggressive inspections. But the narrative had shifted. The community, the law, and even the media were now watching. And I was ready for whatever came next. Days passed quietly, but the calm was deceptive. The HOA's silence was not peace. It was plotting. I knew their next move would be aggressive. And I was right. It started with small provocations. Notices appeared on my door, each one more absurd than the last. "Your garden gnome is too tall." "Paint on your door is not approved." "Your mailbox is out of alignment." Each violation was trivial, but intended to provoke frustration and fear. I refused to react impulsively. Every notice was photographed, logged, and time-stamped. The pattern was clear: harassment disguised as enforcement. My counter-strategy was to remain calm and meticulously document everything. Then came the inspection. 2 board members appeared unannounced, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing every inch of my property. Their eyes darted suspiciously, their tone clipped and hostile. I greeted them politely, but firmly reminded them that all HOA inspections must be scheduled and within legal limits. They left frustrated, muttering under their breath. I knew the escalation had begun. The next week, the HOA circulated a community email subtly attacking me, questioning the legality of my solar panels and hinting at hidden violations. This was a public smear campaign, but I was ready. I responded with a clear, factual rebuttal, including legal citations and evidence. I sent it to every resident, highlighting the HOA's overreach. Then came the most aggressive move yet, a notice threatening daily fines of hundreds of dollars if the panels were not removed within 10 days. Their bluff was bold, but transparent. I called my lawyer and drafted a formal response, challenging every violation, citing local ordinances, and warning of potential legal consequences. I also prepared a public statement for neighbors, making it clear that the fines were unlawful. By the day the fines were supposed to start, the HOA was paralyzed. Residents, now aware of the situation, began attending meetings in larger numbers, demanding accountability. The board's desperate attempt to intimidate had backfired. One evening, I received a terse email from the HOA president. "We may need to reconsider our approach." That line carried the weight of defeat. Their desperation was palpable. I realized then that this was more than just a personal battle. It was a test of integrity, persistence, and courage. By standing firm, documenting meticulously, and engaging the community, I had turned fear into leverage. The panels stayed. The fines never materialized. And for the first time, the HOA understood that power without legitimacy is fragile, especially when faced with someone prepared to defend their rights relentlessly. I stepped outside, sunlight glinting off the panels, feeling not just relief, but a profound satisfaction. The battle was far from over, but for now, I had proven that methodical courage and strategic action could dismantle even the most entrenched authority. The air was thick with anticipation. The neighborhood had started to notice the tension between me and the HOA. Every casual stroll past my house felt like walking through a silent battlefield. The panels gleamed defiantly in the sun, a subtle testament to the struggle quietly unfolding. One morning, I received an official-looking envelope. My heart raced for a moment, but I remained calm. Inside was a summons to a special HOA hearing, the so-called showdown. They intended to intimidate me publicly, to brand me as a troublemaker. I prepared meticulously. Every notice, every email, every photograph, every legal citation, everything was organized into a detailed dossier. I also prepared a statement for neighbors, ensuring transparency and community awareness. This was no longer just about me. It was about standing for fairness and justice. The hearing day arrived. The HOA board sat at a long table, faces stern, eyes fixed on me. Residents filled the room, curious, anxious, some supportive, some skeptical. Cameras discreetly recorded the proceedings, evidence for anyone who might try to twist the narrative later. The president opened with a rehearsed speech, citing violations, legal jargon, and the supposed community impact of my panels. But their arguments were hollow, based on subjective opinions and procedural mistakes. I spoke next. Calm, precise, and unwavering, I presented my evidence. Photographs, emails, legal documents, and records of their unlawful fines and notices. Each point I made was grounded in fact, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The room shifted. Some board members squirmed, realizing their authority was crumbling. Residents murmured in agreement, nodding at the clarity and fairness of my case. I could feel the momentum turning. Then I revealed a crucial fact. A city ordinance explicitly supporting my installation of solar panels and prohibiting the fines they attempted to enforce. The room went silent. The HOA had miscalculated. Their bluff had been exposed. Questions came from neighbors, challenging the board's credibility. Emails, social media posts, and community feedback had turned public opinion. Their authority, once unquestioned, was now fragile. The president struggled to regain control, but the pattern was clear. The board's harassment had backfired. Every attempt to intimidate had strengthened my position and unified the community. By the end of the hearing, the HOA was forced to retract all fines, rescind all arbitrary notices, and issue a formal acknowledgement of procedural mistakes. The panels remained untouched, a symbol of resilience. Walking home afterward, I felt a mixture of relief and triumph. The battle had tested patience, strategy, and courage. More importantly, it had transformed a personal conflict into a lesson for the entire community, that integrity, preparation, and steadfast resolve can overcome even the most entrenched systems of authority. The HOA, once a looming threat, was now diminished, cautious, and aware that power without legitimacy is fleeting. And I, standing beside my solar panels, felt an unspoken pride, an understanding that calm persistence and smart action can turn even fearsome adversaries into cautionary tales. The sun set, casting golden light across the panels. It wasn't just a victory. It was a moment of vindication, a testament to strategy, courage, and the enduring power of standing up for what is. The days after the hearing were strangely quiet. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, but the tension had shifted. The HOA, once looming like a shadow over every decision, now seemed tentative, cautious in every communication. I walked past my house one morning, sunlight glinting off the panels. The golden reflection felt like a quiet celebration. For weeks, these panels had symbolized more than energy efficiency. They were a statement, a declaration of resilience, of standing firm in the face of arbitrary authority. Neighbors approached me, curious and supportive. One by one, they shared stories of minor grievances they had endured with the HOA. Some had been hesitant to speak before, afraid of retaliation. But seeing someone confront the system successfully gave them courage. I realized then that this victory wasn't just mine. It was communal. A subtle shift had occurred in the neighborhood's culture. People who had once stayed silent now discussed HOA policies openly, aware of their rights and empowered to protect their own spaces. Late at night, I reviewed the hearing notes, rereading each email, every ordinance, and every photograph that had been presented. It was meticulous work, but necessary. I saw patterns, moments where I could have faltered, and times when calm reasoning had turned potential disaster into triumph. It struck me that the battle had been less about solar panels and more about preparation, strategy, and understanding the law. The power of knowledge and patience had outmatched authority wielded without legitimacy. Friends who had followed my struggle offered congratulations, some in disbelief that I had managed to remain so composed under pressure. "You didn't just fight them," one said. "You taught them a lesson about respect." That simple phrase stayed with me. Even the HOA's tone in subsequent emails changed. The once commanding, threatening letters became measured, neutral, almost cautious. They knew that public scrutiny and proper documentation could unravel their authority if they overstepped again. At home, I took a moment to sit by the panels, tracing the paths of sunlight over their surfaces. The struggle had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times deeply isolating. Yet it also reminded me that standing firm, armed with facts, patience, and composure, could turn intimidation into accountability. I reflected on my own growth. Before this ordeal, I might have reacted impulsively, emotionally, or defensively. Now, I had learned the value of strategy over reaction, calm over fear, and evidence over assumption. Each interaction had been a lesson in human behavior, power dynamics, and resilience. Even my child noticed the change. "Mom/Dad, you're like a superhero," he said one evening, eyes wide with admiration. "You didn't just win, you made them follow the rules." I smiled, realizing that this victory was also a teaching moment about courage and integrity. The neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. Conversations around fences, doors, and garden choices were no longer filled with fear, but with cautious optimism. I had become an unexpected reference point for fairness, someone who could quietly guide others in navigating rules, policies, and the subtle pressures of HOA politics. In these reflective days, I understood a simple truth. Sometimes the quietest, most measured victories resonate the loudest. Standing for what is right doesn't always require confrontation in its loudest form. It requires patience, preparation, and an unshakable calm. Just when I thought the ordeal was over, an unexpected email arrived. The subject line alone made my heart skip. Urgent review of recent HOA decisions. At first glance, it seemed routine, almost bureaucratic. But the language was pointed, formal, with an undertone of threat. They were questioning not my panels, but some newly installed landscape modifications, minor, aesthetic changes that had gone unnoticed until now. A wave of frustration and anxiety hit me. I had anticipated celebration, not another battle. But deep down, I knew this was part of the rhythm. Whenever authority feels challenged, it seeks to reassert control, even over trivial matters. I opened the email carefully, analyzing each line. The HOA cited obscure clauses, phrased ambiguously, designed to confuse homeowners and assert dominance. My hands clenched around my laptop. I had dealt with the main issue successfully, but this reminded me that vigilance was a continuous responsibility. I called my trusted friend and legal consultant. "Looks like they're testing the waters again," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We need a careful, documented response. No room for emotional reactions." Together, we drafted a meticulous reply. Every clause cited, every precedent referenced, every photograph carefully annotated. I wasn't reacting impulsively this time. I was prepared, armed with knowledge, and confident in my approach. Days passed. The HOA sent a representative to inspect the property in person. I watched as they scrutinized every minor detail, taking notes and photographs. My heart raced, but I stayed composed, greeting them politely, answering questions succinctly. Every interaction was a subtle assertion. Calm authority can outmatch intimidation. Then came the moment of revelation. While reviewing their inspection notes, I noticed an error. One clause they cited didn't even apply to my property. A small oversight, but critical. I realized this was my leverage. The HOA's own documentation now undermined their claim. With careful precision, I submitted the corrected analysis. The board responded hesitantly, their confident tone now tempered with caution. They couldn't escalate without exposing their own mistakes. The final twist. One of my neighbors, previously quiet and hesitant, came forward unexpectedly. They shared evidence of similar overreach by the HOA in the past, supporting my case indirectly. This small act of solidarity amplified the effect, proving that the system's intimidation tactics were not as airtight as they appeared. By the end of the week, the HOA officially dropped their challenge. The landscape modifications were officially recognized as compliant. My panels continued to gleam in the sun, a quiet testament to persistence, preparation, and calm resilience. I exhaled, a mixture of relief and subtle triumph washing over me. The unexpected twist had reminded me that vigilance was ongoing, that authority could always attempt to reassert control, but that knowledge, composure, and community support were stronger than fear. As I looked around the neighborhood, I realized that every resident had witnessed a subtle transformation. The HOA's intimidation had lost its power. Confidence, documentation, and strategic calm had rewritten the rules, proving that measured courage could outlast arbitrary authority. With the HOA challenge finally dropped, I thought the storm had passed. But experience had taught me that true victory wasn't just in surviving the conflict. It was in understanding its broader impact and cementing a sense of permanence. I began reviewing the entire process, from the initial notice about my solar panels to the latest email about landscaping. Each interaction, each document, each moment of tension had been a piece of a complex puzzle. It became clear that this battle was not just about my home. It was about establishing boundaries, clarity, and precedent for the entire community. I reached out to neighbors quietly, discussing the steps I had taken and the reasoning behind each action. Many were surprised, some even embarrassed. They had quietly endured similar pressures, but never questioned the HOA's authority. My story inspired conversations about fairness, transparency, and accountability. Slowly, a subtle shift began in the neighborhood culture. Residents felt emboldened, aware that knowledge and preparation could neutralize intimidation. Meanwhile, I focused on my own property. The panels gleamed under the sun. The landscaping stood elegant and undisturbed. Every detail reflected months of careful planning, research, and resilience. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was a quiet statement. Calm, informed action could protect what was rightfully yours. Then came a meeting of the HOA board. For the first time, the atmosphere was noticeably different. They were measured in their tone, hesitant in their language. I presented my case for permanent documentation of landscape and property modifications. There was no anger, no hostility, Only formal recognition of compliance and rules clarified for future reference. The board officially amended the guidelines, ensuring clearer language and fairer procedures. They even acknowledged in writing that homeowners had the right to review and respond to any notices, ensuring transparency going forward. It was a small victory in legal terms, but monumental in principle. The power dynamic had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. In the following weeks, I noticed changes in the neighborhood. Conversations grew open, and neighbors began to assert their rights calmly, politely, and confidently. The HOA no longer relied solely on intimidation. They had to engage transparently, document thoroughly, and interact respectfully. A new standard had been set. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that every moment of tension had taught a lesson. Authority could intimidate, but knowledge neutralized fear. Documentation ensured accountability. Patience and composure transformed anxiety into strategy, and community support amplified individual resilience. By the time the sun set on the quiet streets of my neighborhood, the battle felt truly won, not through confrontation, but through preparation, strategy, and measured action. The solar panels, the landscaping, and even the minor modifications were symbols of persistence, intelligence, and courage. Looking back, the experience had been transformative. What began as a fight over property had become a lesson in human behavior, strategy, and resilience. The HOA had underestimated not just me, but the collective power of informed and prepared residents. And in that realization, I found a quiet, enduring satisfaction. Months passed since the final amendment of the HOA guidelines. Life returned to a peaceful rhythm, yet the lessons lingered in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking through my neighborhood, I noticed subtle shifts, conversations at morning jogs, brief exchanges over fences, and smiles from neighbors who now spoke with newfound confidence. A quiet revolution had taken place, invisible yet tangible. I often reflected on how a single dispute had grown into a lesson about preparation, persistence, and perspective. At first, it seemed like a trivial conflict over solar panels, landscaping, and property aesthetics. But in retrospect, it was a microcosm of a larger truth. Power is often exercised through intimidation, but it can be dismantled by knowledge, strategy, and calm determination. One evening, as the golden light of sunset spilled over the rooftops, I sat in my garden. The solar panels glinted softly. The trees and shrubs stood proud and undisturbed, and the quiet hum of daily life filled the air. I realized that the home I had fought for had become more than a living space. It was a testament to resilience. Every modification, every carefully preserved detail, symbolized the boundaries I had established not just for myself, but for the community. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to ask advice. Some had faced minor disputes. Others were curious about the new HOA rules. I offered guidance patiently, explaining not just the steps I had taken, but the mindset behind each action. Knowledge, I realized, was contagious. Empowering others created a ripple effect stronger than any confrontation. I also kept detailed notes, a sort of personal manual for navigating HOA interactions. This wasn't just for myself. It was a record for anyone who might face similar challenges in the future. I included timelines, email templates, legal references, and practical strategies for negotiation. Each page reflected not only the challenges I had overcome, but the wisdom I had gained. As time went on, I saw the subtle cultural change solidify. The HOA became more accountable, residents more engaged. Disputes were approached calmly, documented clearly, and resolved fairly. The atmosphere, once tense and intimidating, now felt balanced, almost cooperative. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't require fanfare or public recognition, yet it carried a lasting impact. Reflecting personally, I realized the experience had changed me fundamentally. I had learned patience under pressure, clarity in communication, and strategic thinking in the face of opposition. I had discovered that calm assertiveness could counteract intimidation, that preparation could transform fear into confidence, and that resilience often lies in subtle, consistent action rather than dramatic confrontation. One night, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, I looked out over the neighborhood. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long, peaceful shadows. I felt a sense of closure, not just for the specific disputes, but for the anxiety and uncertainty that had once consumed me. What remained was pride, reflection, and the quiet satisfaction of having created a safer, fairer environment. Ultimately, this journey was more than a personal triumph. It was a lesson in empowerment, responsibility, and legacy. By standing firm, documenting thoroughly, and acting with integrity, I had not only protected my home, but also influenced a community. And in that influence, I found a deeper, enduring sense of accomplishment. The HOA battle had begun with tension, fear, and uncertainty, but it ended with clarity, fairness, and mutual respect. The solar panels, the landscaping, the careful planning, they were not just physical objects, but symbols of thoughtful perseverance. They told a story of strategy, courage, and quiet transformation. And as I finally closed my notes for the night, I understood the ultimate lesson. True victory lies not in confrontation or aggression, but in preparation, calm intelligence, and the lasting positive change one can inspire. The legacy of that summer, of that battle, would quietly endure for years to come, not as drama, but as example,